So in today's web dev tip, we're going to take a look at a couple of different ways that you can view the data that we're putting into our MongoDB database. Now, we haven't really had a need to do this so far because all of the information has been accessible via the API. But as we saw in the last tutorial, when we're inserting those redirect bits of information, we can't actually see the response that's been inserted into the database. So it might be useful from time to time just have a quick look in there just to make sure things are working as you would expect them to. So we've got two options really to access data in MongoDB in the local Docker instance that we've got running. The first is to use the command line. So if you go on over to the MongoDB documentation, there's some information about how to install it for your operating system. So I'll put a link to that in the description below. And also there is the Compass Gui tool. So there's an application that you can use to inspect the database. And that's probably a little bit easier to use if you're more not familiar with MongoDB statements and commands. So we'll take a look at both options quickly just to show you which one you might want to use. So the first thing we will need to know is the actual MongoDB connection string. So that, if you remember in our API code, is in the environments file. So you may have something a bit different to this, but this is the one that I created for our Rick and Roll project here. So if we just copy that connection string onto our clipboard, and then first we'll head on over to the CLI to access the database remotely here. So if we first of all use the Mongo command, you'll need the CLI tool installed from the previous documentation as mentioned for this to work, and then just paste in that connection string. What we'll find is we'll be able to connect to the Mongo database that's running inside of our Docker container, and then we can run some MongoDB commands here. The first thing we'll want to do though, because we're using a specific database for our project, so if you've got something set up, you might want to use the use command to specify the database to reference. So here I'm going to switch to the Rick and Roll database. And then if I say something like db URLs, because that's the collection where we're saving our short URLs into, and then do find with no options, it'll run a query against the database and bring back any results for that find operation. I've just actually completely cleared out the database, so there's nothing in there at the moment. But if we go on over to our application and just generate one of those new short URLs, let's just refresh the page here. If we create a new short URL, that's now been written into the database. So we'll go back on over to the terminal and run that command again. And now you can see we've got an object in there, and we've got all of the different bits of information, including that redirect property that we added in yesterday's tutorial. So the whole purpose of checking this information was to see if this redirect property actually gets populated correctly. So what we'll do is we'll actually copy the URL onto our clipboard, and then we'll just paste that into the browser to actually visit the URL. And obviously we get redirected as we have done before. Let's just pause that so the adverts don't keep running. And now if we go back again one last time to the terminal and run that command again, we should find now that the redirects property has been updated with that information. So we can see when it was accessed and also the IP address of where it was accessed from. And because I'm using it locally, I'm just getting the local address. And I have noticed a bit of a problem here. I think we're setting the default property to be called redirect, and then we're updating redirect. So let's go and fix that in our code before we go any further. So the problem we've got there is in the short URLs route is where we're actually creating this property here. It should say redirects to match what we're using when we're updating that property. Not a big deal, but it's worth fixing now while we see that. Okay, so that seems to be working okay, but let's just have a look at Compass as well to see how you might be able to access this data in the GUI as well, because as you can see, it's not that easy to actually read here. So this is the Compass application, and very similar to the CLI, we need to provide a connection string to actually connect to the database. So let's just, I think it's probably gone off my clipboard now, but let's just copy that back to the clipboard so we can paste it in. So that MongoDB connection string, and we'll just click edit here. It'll just warn you saying you're going to share over on your credentials, but that's okay, we don't mind too much about that. So let's click connect. And what you should find is you're connected to that Docker container, and there's some various different databases available on it. So if we click on the Rick and Roll database, you can see we get into the collection, much as we did on the CLI. And if we go to URLs, You can see it shows you all of the data. It automatically does a find for you just to kind of show you what information's in there. But you can see here that's that exact same object we were looking at on the CLI a second ago. So let's just have a look at this information here. You can see that same redirects property with the object that we created when it was accessed inside there. And if we just go back to the redirect URL again and just copy that, paste it into the browser there. So the YouTube seems to be carrying on playing and doing whatever it wants to do here. But if we go back to Compass, we've created a new redirect into that record in the database. So if we just do a refresh or do another find, you can see here, now we've got two objects, two entries in the array for redirects. And you can see the second one is a few minutes later than the first one that we created a moment ago. So there you go, there's a couple of ways that you can access your data in the Mongo database. You can either use the CLI, which is nice and quick, but obviously it's a bit unreadable, and you've got the Compass application, which obviously gives you a nicer interface, and you can do a lot more in here as well. You can edit the data or play around with things if you need to too. But that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.